Have you ever witnessed an entire room fall into silence? Just because of a single slap? Not a slap between two strangers, but a police officer, slapping a black woman across the face, right in the middle of a courtroom. What did you think happened next? Another familiar cover-up? A half-hearted apology before everything got swept under the rug? No. Because that woman wasn't just any victim. She was Judge Miriam Grant. And in the very moment she was most disrespected, she stood up and forced the system to bow down. In this video, you will witness how one slap exposed decades of unchecked abuse of power. How one woman dared to confront not just a person, but an entire system. And ultimately, the question that made millions of Americans wonder: are we living under a system of justice, or in a collective compromise with what's wrong? If you've ever felt small in the face of injustice, if you've ever seen someone mistreated because of their race, gender, or status, then today's story will show you. You are not alone. And you can change that. Now, let's go back to that fateful morning, where a seemingly ordinary woman, without a robe or a crown, with nothing but unwavering conviction, made an entire city stop and listen. That morning, like many others, Judge Miriam Grant entered the courtroom with her hair neatly tied back, a dark coat draped over her petite frame, and the piercing gaze of someone who had spent her life believing in justice. She wasn't wearing her robe. She hadn't yet taken the judge's bench. She was just a black woman walking into a courtroom. And then, the slap happened. A loud smack tore through the courtroom's silence. The officer, Carter Blake, had raised his hand and struck her across the face. Not because she resisted. Not because there was any justifiable reason. But simply, because he thought she wasn't someone that mattered. Just a brief moment. But what it awakened would be anything but brief. That slap didn't just land on a woman's face. It struck down 30 years of service. It struck the belief that people of color can't be the face of justice. It struck the memories of thousands who had once been insulted in silence, and forced them to remember. And in that very moment, when most would choose silence or step back, Miriam didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't react the way the system expected her to. She stood tall, turned to face the man who raised his hand, and said with a voice as calm as it was chilling, "Sergeant Blake, you just struck a sitting judge in a courtroom." That moment, no cameras, no performance. Just truth, and one woman refusing to back down. If you've ever heard of Judge Olu Stevens in Kentucky, who faced backlash for challenging racial bias in jury selection, then you'd understand, in the justice system, not all voices are heard equally. And if you're a black woman, sometimes, just existing is already a battle. Justice doesn't come from the seat we occupy. It comes from the way we rise when we've been knocked down. No robe needed. No nameplate on an office door. Just someone brave enough to say, "Not today." What made that moment so powerful wasn't just the slap, but what it set into motion afterward. Because after that slap, Miriam didn't just resist. She kicked open a door that countless others had knocked on in vain. A door that led straight into the heart of a truth. A truth about a system the public had long suspected was broken. And that was where this journey began. But to understand why that slap didn't just sting one woman, but shook an entire structure to its core, we need to go back. Back to the woman who didn't need to raise her voice to make a city listen. Some people wear judicial robes to be respected. Others, like Miriam Grant, are respected even without one. Before she was Judge Grant, she was just Miriam, a black girl from East Side Charleston, a neighborhood where every street held a forgotten story. She studied on scholarships, worked nights at diners, was once rejected from a legal internship because the firm said she had a profile too difficult for client relations. She wasn't difficult. She just didn't look like what they were used to seeing in that seat of power. But instead of anger, Miriam chose learning. Instead of hatred, she chose understanding. And instead of silence, she chose to keep moving. To become the change others hadn't dared to dream of. She worked as a public defender. Represented clients with no money, no voice, no hope. She once sat through lunch with a defendant just to show them they still deserved to be heard. Then she became a prosecutor, not to convict blindly, but to clean the system from the inside. And finally, she was appointed judge. The first black woman to sit at the highest bench in the city's court. Not because someone gave her a shot, but because she earned it. Like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. Miriam's journey is living proof that sometimes you don't need to break down a door. You just need to be strong enough to open it, from the inside. People may look at you and see only your race, your gender, your background. But you decide what they remember you for. Miriam never demanded recognition. She worked. She lived. And she treated people fairly, so consistently that her quiet resolve became a declaration. Ironically, the slap in that courtroom didn't happen despite her being a judge. It happened because she was a judge, and a black woman without her robe on. It exposed a bitter truth. Even when you break through the glass ceiling, there will still be those who pretend you don't exist. And that was when Miriam realized. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was a test for the entire system. And once you know who she is, you'll understand exactly why someone like Carter Blake, a man used to unchecked power, believed he could slap her, and walk away. Lieutenant Carter Blake was once seen as the model officer. Clean-cut, disciplined, by the book. A third-generation cop, he wore the uniform like a badge of legacy. But behind it was something more dangerous than any weapon. An arrogance that knew no limits. Blake didn't need to shout to be heard. He only needed to enter a room. And the system would clear the path for him. For over 20 years, Blake had never been formally disciplined. Not because he was flawless, but because every complaint conveniently disappeared. His arrogance didn't come from personality. It came from an invisible shield of protection, provided by the very system meant to hold him accountable. He believed he could do anything, as long as he looked good on paper, as long as no one stood up. So when he slapped Miriam Grant, he wasn't worried. Because in his mind, she was just a black woman standing in the wrong place. He didn't know. She was actually the highest-ranking person in that entire room. If you followed the case of Officer Daniel Holtzclaw, who assaulted dozens of poor black women believing no one would believe them, you'd understand. Arrogance can grow so vast. It believes silence is permanent. Arrogance has a scent. But it only gets punished when someone dares to turn on the light. And Miriam was that someone. She didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She simply sat on the judge's bench. And made him, for the first time in his life, call a black woman Your Honor. From slap to indictment took just a few hours. But for Blake, it was a fall years in the making. Built on both contempt and complacency. He didn't fall because of one mistake. He fell because an entire life had been allowed to go unchecked. And when the system finally cracked, he had nowhere left to hide. But the scariest part of Blake's story wasn't the slap. It was the nods. The signatures. The silences that protected him all these years. That's the deepest layer of this story. No one keeps power that long without someone holding up the ladder. When Miriam requested Carter Blake's disciplinary records, she didn't just find pages. She found an entire network. People who had shielded him for more than 2 decades. The first, a prosecutor who had sat in her courtroom for 5 years, refused to charge Blake in at least 5 cases with solid evidence. Reason: insufficient grounds for prosecution. The second, a senior judge who once mentored Miriam as a legal intern, had signed off on dismissing an indictment against Blake in 2019. A case involving a 17-year-old boy who ended up hospitalized. The third, fourth, fifth. The list grew. Not because people slipped up once, but because they had stayed silent long enough for wrong to multiply. Miriam realized, Blake wasn't the problem. He was just the symptom. The real problem was a system that had bargained with itself, trading truth for stability, justice for brotherhood. There were no written agreements, no memos, just one silent deal. I'll stay quiet when you're wrong, so you'll stay quiet when I am. In the Rampart scandal of Los Angeles, nearly 70 officers were investigated for fabricated reports, abuse, and violence. The reason the scandal lasted so long? Because everyone had gotten used to the idea that cover-up is just internal culture. And the worst part? Even good people stayed silent. Out of fear of losing their job, of having their career frozen, of becoming a target. The system doesn't collapse because bad people do bad things. It collapses because good people say nothing. At this point, Miriam was no longer standing before a man who assaulted her. She was standing before an entire power structure that had survived on silence. And she knew, to break it, you couldn't just investigate. You had to shine a light into the corners the system hoped would stay dark forever. And that's when the slap became a declaration of war. Because it wasn't just Miriam who was threatened anymore. They began sending messages to her nephew, taking pictures. Silent, but deliberate. She knew this was no longer a legal battle. It was a fight to protect her own family. And as Miriam began peeling back the layers of dust, she didn't just find misconduct. She found an invisible hand trying to hold her back. By reaching for what she loved most. Miriam once thought fighting injustice was a career. Something handled during court hours. With thick case files and bullet-pointed statutes. Until a photo arrived at her house, with no return address. It showed her nephew, riding his bike home from school. On the back, a single scribbled line. Stay in your lane. She'd seen a lot in her years of practicing law. But never had she felt a chill quite like the one that ran through her body as she held that picture. The fight had left the courtroom. It had crept into the alleyways of home. To the place where the child she loved most in the world walked every day. And when injustice knocks on your front door, you can't respond with due process. You have to act. Miriam called the Federal Investigation Unit. Requested immediate protection for her nephew and her sister's family. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. There was only one thing in her eyes. Resolve. Because she knew, from that moment on, this was no longer just an inquiry. It was a fight to prove. The truth will not back down under threat. In 2014, investigative journalist Cheryl Atkinson, who exposed government corruption, had her devices hacked. Her family watched. Her life threatened. She once said, "I don't fear the truth. I only fear it being buried by those with enough power to do so." Miriam, even as a judge, now stood in that same place. Between justice and a machine trying to silence her with fear. When the guilty know you're closing in on the truth, they don't argue. They intimidate. And that's the clearest sign of all. You're getting close. From that point forward, Miriam didn't just want to expose Carter Blake. She wanted to rip off the final curtain of a system where the biggest names still hid behind leather chairs. polished offices, and handshakes beneath the table. The battle was now beyond personal, beyond professional. It had become a mission. And in the face of fear, Miriam was more determined than ever. If they would dare threaten her family to protect what's wrong, she would drag it into the light, all of it. The Charleston City Courthouse was built from white marble. Cool, solid, and seemingly impenetrable. But Miriam knew better. What truly rots, always starts from the inside. When the federal investigation team reopened old case files bearing Carter Blake's name, they didn't just find traces of a rogue officer. They uncovered an entire ecosystem of cover UPS. Dismissed indictments. Missing footage. Cases rushed and closed with careless reasoning. In just 3 days, over 140 files were marked red. All had one thing in common. Blake was at the scene. Yet he had never been seriously investigated. Worse, many of the cases involved minors, people of color, defendants without private attorneys. The truth surfaced like dust blown off stone. Each old document was a forgotten voice. And Miriam knew. Every hidden case was a wound left unhealed. It mirrored the Baltimore Gun Trace Task Force scandal. A once praised police unit exposed for fabricating evidence, stealing from victims, framing innocent people. Only when a small crack formed did the entire rotten structure come crashing down. Miriam was witnessing something eerily similar. Inside the very place she once believed was a temple of justice. Not everything made of stone is built to last. Some systems stand only because no one dared to reach beneath the surface. But now, things were different. Miriam didn't just want Blake prosecuted. She wanted to go to the root. To name, out loud, those who had torn the truth apart. Then stitched it shut with silence. The list grew longer by the day. Prosecutors who made deals. Judges who signed dismissals. A former police chief who missed the call. Shady legal funds funneled into support accounts. She knew. The closer she got to the truth, the more people she would frighten. Because she wasn't just trying to punish one man. She was trying to reset the very principles that define what justice means in her city. And that truth couldn't stay buried in sealed files. It had to come out. Not just for the law to see, but for the public to witness. A courtroom is supposed to be a place of calm, where judges speak little, but every word lands like stone. So when Miriam Grant walked out of that courtroom, a file in hand, eyes meeting every camera without flinching, people were stunned. Not because she spoke, but because, for the first time, a judge dared to say aloud the truth everyone else kept dodging. She didn't hold a quiet press conference. She didn't read a pre-written statement. She stood before the press, her colleagues, the public. Even those who once doubted her. And in a calm but unwavering voice, she said, "This is no longer a personal matter. This is the failure of a system I once believed in." In her hand wasn't just an indictment. It was a list of 12 names. Prosecutors. Officers. Judges. People who had, for years, helped bury the truth. She didn't read each name aloud. She didn't need to shame anyone. She simply said, "These individuals will be investigated. Not because I'm a victim, but because justice is not something you can stand outside of." In 2018, when Christine Blasey Ford testified before Congress about a sexual assault involving a Supreme Court nominee, she wasn't the highest legal authority in the room. But she made the entire country listen. Not by shouting, but by speaking a truth that didn't tremble. Miriam, in that moment, wasn't just a judge. She was a citizen with a conscience. And that changed everything. Sometimes, to preserve the dignity of a system, You must first break the silence that has protected it for too long. After her public statement, social media exploded. Headlines screamed, "Black judge exposes decades of systemic cover UPS." People gathered outside the courthouse, not to riot, but to feel, for the first time, that the truth was finally within reach. An elderly woman held a photo of her grandson, wrongfully convicted years ago. A young black man shouted, "We believe you, Judge Grant." And in that moment, Miriam understood. This fight was no longer hers alone. But when justice begins to speak, old powers don't sit quietly. They retaliate. And they did it with precision. Not through open threats, but by attacking the one thing Miriam had built over a lifetime: her reputation. Because the brighter the light, the more violently the shadows flail. And they didn't just use power. They used filth to make Miriam bow her head. When you dig too deep into the truth, don't be surprised when darkness begins to strike back. Miriam knew this. She just didn't expect it to come so fast, or so coordinated. Within days of the investigation list going public, anonymous articles flooded media outlets. Judge Grant previously sued for bias. Questions around degree authenticity. Ties to radical groups in college. No evidence. No sources. Just suggestive headlines and cropped images. Enough to plant doubt, but not enough to press charges. At the same time, strange new accounts flooded social media, spreading hashtags like "Activist Judge," "Miriam is not neutral," "Grant must go." Miriam wasn't shocked. She was saddened. Not because her honor was attacked, but because she recognized the tactic instantly. This is how the system reacts when it's finally cornered. When prosecutor Marilyn Mosby, who charged 6 officers in the death of Freddie Gray, began uncovering deeper corruption, the media suddenly turned on her. Her finances, her family, her public speeches. Not to seek justice, but to destroy credibility. Miriam understood. This wasn't about law anymore. This was an information war, where truth was drowned in noise, and victims were painted as people with personal agendas. When you bring wrongdoing into the light, they won't argue with you. They'll try to destroy who you are. But Miriam didn't fight back on their terms. She didn't run to news outlets to deny every rumor. She stayed silent, and handed over a fresh set of case files to federal investigators. Because she knew, if she wavered, those watching her would lose faith in standing up. The dirtiness of the smear campaign only confirmed one thing: they had no other way to stop her, except making the world stop listening. But this time, the people didn't stay silent. They began calling out the fake reports. They resharded Miriam's original speech. They sent thank you letters, left flowers at the courthouse. And perhaps, more than any investigation, that was the clearest proof. She was on the right path. And then one day, when every disguise had fallen, Miriam stepped onto the witness stand. Not to speak for herself, but to speak for an entire generation that had been silenced. That courtroom didn't feel familiar anymore. The air was tight, like a drawn string. Every seat was filled. Journalists packed the hallways. It wasn't just because the case was big. It was because everyone knew. This trial wasn't just about one man. It was about putting the entire system under oath. The man in the defendant's chair was Carter Blake, former police officer. But when Miriam took the witness stand, no one looked at him anymore. They looked at the woman who had once been slapped in public, and who now, with calm strength and no hatred, was speaking the truth. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She simply told, from beginning to end, what happened. And what it meant. He didn't slap me because he didn't know who I was. Miriam said. He slapped me because he believed I could never be someone who mattered. Her words didn't just silence the jury. They stilled the entire courtroom. And then, others followed. A victim Blake once assaulted in a dark alley. A young prosecutor told to destroy a file. A former internal affairs officer who revealed how evidence had gone missing. Just like the Derek Chauvin trial. The officer who murdered George Floyd. This wasn't just about two people in a courtroom. It was a mirror held up to society. A moment to reckon with how we let power operate unchecked. For far too long. And when the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. No one clapped. No one cheered. Only a quiet feeling spread. Finally, someone had paid the price. But everyone knew. The fight was far from over. Justice doesn't end with a verdict. It begins when a community chooses to stop looking away. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. Over 140 old convictions were reopened. A state-level investigation into the justice system was launched. A reform committee was formed. And victims, once forgotten, were called by name again. Miriam didn't stand on a podium. She didn't deliver a grand speech. She simply returned to her office. And began clearing out her desk. Because she knew. Some forms of justice can't come from the old guard. They need new hands. Young voices. People no longer afraid. When the sentence was handed down, everyone turned to her. Not to applaud. But to ask. What now? Will you stay? But Miriam had known the answer, for a long time. Some people leave their names etched in stone. Others leave footprints in people's hearts, even without a plaque. Miriam Grant was the latter. 3 months after the historic trial, she walked into the Judicial Council with a single sheet of paper. It wasn't a reform proposal. It wasn't another case file. It was her letter of resignation. It's not because I'm tired, she said gently. It's because I believe. Some structures can only be rebuilt if the ones who built them first step aside. The chamber fell completely silent. Many thought she'd stay to lead the changes. To witness the reform she had fought for. But Miriam understood. Real change doesn't need someone to cling to the chair. It needs people brave enough to do the same old things. In newer, better ways. Just like Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The legendary Supreme Court Justice. Who inspired generations of women. Not with slogans. But with relentless action. Her legacy didn't live in her name. It lived in those she awakened. Miriam left the courthouse. Not to applause. But to the solemn silence. That only deep gratitude can bring. On the marble steps, her nephew waited. His backpack slung off one shoulder. The boy who once made her afraid. Was now the reason she felt at peace to walk away. He hugged her and whispered. You made them listen. She smiled and replied. Not just listen. Remember. And you'll be the one to remind them, if they ever forget. Legacy isn't what we hold onto. It's what we're willing to let go of. So that something better can bloom. Miriam didn't need a bronze statue outside the courthouse. She didn't need a street named after her. She only needed to know. She stood up, when it mattered. And stayed silent, when it was time to pass the mic. This story doesn't end with triumph or defeat. It ends with continuance. With a new generation. Inspired not by speeches. But by the quiet, unwavering resolve. Of one woman. Who refused to bow. And if you've stayed with this story to the end. Ask yourself. What will I leave behind? when I step away from the place I once belonged. You don't have to be a judge, a journalist, or an activist. You only have to choose not to stay silent when the truth is buried beneath what's comfortable. If this story has touched something in you, share it. Not for views, not for likes, but because someone out there may need a reason to stand up. And maybe you just gave it to them. Thank you for listening to the very end. And remember, justice never echoes on its own. It only lives when someone is brave enough to speak it out loud.